Jordan Peterson, a leading clinical psychologist, is quoted as pointing out that if you want to hurt someone and hurt them severely, you don't attack them when they're wrong or for their faults. What you do is you gang up and actually attack them for something they did right, for their competency, for something beautiful and noble. And in that context, one of the things that happens culturally as in the relationship between the individual and the environment is there's a chicken and egg dynamic. Sociopathic environments produce sociopathic states in the individuals in those environments. We're all equipped with basically 4 different levels of brain function. And when you cause pain, when you betray, when you hurt and abandon an individual, you increase the functioning of the reptilian brain, the fight, flight, freeze dynamic. Because what's communicated by the environment in that situation is that one is surrounded by reptiles. When trauma is induced and then maintained in a chronic state by sociopathic behavior, there is a message to the brain. One is surrounded by reptiles, and an activation and acceleration of the reptilian brainstem. Simultaneously, the way PTSD and trauma is healed is with empathy. One could also say love, in the journey of love, where love begins with caring. I love you, and I love you enough to see you. This is the very first step in realizing the feminine side of love, which is the emotion, towards the masculine expression of love, which is competency. I see you. I see you, and I care enough to understand you. I understand you enough to empathize with you. I empathize with you enough to attune to you. So if you understand someone with empathy, you attune. It's not usually considered incredibly kind or loving to look at someone in a wheelchair and invite them to walk up a mountain or go cliff climbing together. There's a disconnect. There might be an initial thought, it would be nice to go mountain climbing together, but if I love you enough to see you. If I see you enough to understand you. This, of course, takes time. I understand you. If I understand just basic human needs, survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, in order to include you, I have to empathize. I have to empathize, I have to understand, and I have to attune to who you are, to where you are. And at that point, one doesn't invite a quadriplegic to go rock climbing. One doesn't take someone out in a wheelchair and stick them in a whitewater raft. With empathy and understanding comes attunement, comes a modulation of energy such that the interaction flows. Now, attunement has a process of feedback and response, feedback and response. How is this for you? Is this too much? What are your limits? You don't take someone and do 200 push-ups on a first fitness training. You work up. You have to start with a baseline, have some understanding of the muscles involved, and there's an attunement process. If the love is true, such that the seeing is clear and the understanding is accurate, the empathy and the attunement process leads to successful relationship. When there is a successful relationship based on attunement and based on care, there is abundance. You get the phenomena of synergy. Whenever two or more are gathered, you have a phenomena of synergy. And this always increases safety, increases abundance, increases success, which leads to pleasure, which leads to gratitude, which leads to, with the sense of safety, an alchemical response inside, which is an increased sense of well-being. And when someone loves enough to go through that process, the result is always love. Human states at their authentic core, be they traumatic, be they fear-based, be they loving, results in a dissemination of that state, a viral transmission of that state to the human beings around. And usually in that dynamic, the mass, whoever has the biggest leverage in the dynamic, will transmit their state to others. And so you see this phenomena where you have 100 monks chanting in a transcendent state, and one person pulls out a gun and shoots into the ceiling. Suddenly you have a collapse of the transcendent state into fear, because there's a lack of attunement, there's a lack of empathy, there's a lack of love. And in that dynamic, you have 99 monks collapse because of the mass of the gun, particularly if someone is shot, and fear ensues. So whoever has the leverage in a relationship will generally transmit their state to the others around them, and so someone in a leadership position will generally transmit their state to someone in a following position. A teacher position has more mass, more leverage, so they will generally transmit their state to the student rather than the other way around. One person confronting a gang that is trying to harm them, etc., will generally be reduced to the fear level of the gang, and all violence, all violation comes out of the reptilian brainstem. So it's coming out of a survival or security-based instinct rather than coming out of a higher function of empathy and love. And so this understanding that with love in its authentic form always comes competency, and with competency always comes abundance, gratitude, pleasure, increased success, and the synergy of that is the feeling of trust and trustworthiness and love. When that doesn't happen, when someone just uses the words, I love you, but I don't love you enough to see you. I don't love you enough to understand you. I don't understand you enough to empathize with you. And I don't empathize with you enough to attune to you with understanding. Then there is failure. There is dis-ease. There is pain. There are breaches. There are violations. There's dishonor and disrespect. And the relationship is not trustworthy because there is a failure on one or both sides in that attunement process. The phenomena of chemical-induced transcendent states is very real and very powerful. In this case, with Peter Sandhill, a combination of a pushed, meaning Peter Sandhill pushed for a very high dose beyond my comfort level, of psilocybin, my first psychedelic experience, and then pushed to add MDMA to the mix, about three hours in, or so to speak, in a pretty dissociative, overwhelmed state, which is obviously profoundly unloving and incompetent. You cannot find any protocols in therapeutic journals that encourage practitioners to push beyond the comfort level of the participant. And usually all of the competent studies begin with weeks or months of attunement and understanding, of seeing, of caring and understanding and attunement before the patient, when they're ready, will decide on the dose that they feel comfortable with and say yes to the experience. And then there aren't many, if I'm not aware of studies that, from a therapeutic angle, suggest combining substances, particularly for a first time. But what psychedelic compounds do in this situation is they chemically induce an environment in which the more transcendent regions of the brain can function out of context with their environment. Meaning every human child is born with all the various forms of brain functioning available to them. And if they're born into an abusive environment, the reptilian brain will predominate. Because if you're trying to survive in a family of crocodiles, you need the crocodile brain, the reptilian brain, to fight, flight, and freeze, to survive. And that's why it's there. The more abusive the environment, the more the reptilian brain kicks in. We also, of course, have the limbic instinctive brain of raw emotions. We're getting a little bit towards humanity. The human areas of the brain, we start to get empathy. We start to get compassion. And in traumatic cultures such as our own, this is often hit down into reptilian functions. When you lose your job so that investors can save a few pennies in share price, and no thought is given to the family, you're dealing with a sociopathic rather than an empathic environment. So there's a lot of fear, insecurity. It's not at all clear that your human needs to survive with dignity, to feel security with dignity, are anyone's priority in a sociopathic family or a sociopathic capitalist system, where it's, whether you survive or not is irrelevant. What's important is shareholder value. And so then the individuals in that environment become more fear-based, more conscious of how to maneuver in a system that isn't looking out for them, in a system that may be actively trying to hurt them if it will add a few pennies, to the share price. So transcendent consciousness is something we touch very infrequently, because in order for the transcendent brain to open up in a natural ecological state, there needs to be the kind of abundance present in the environment. Typically, before that, you can think of the opening of fruit blossoms in spring. They don't open in a cold environment, because if they do, the crop is lost. And if you force an opening, like go out in the middle of January and heat up the trees, they will open through a forced environment, but when you remove the heat, they're left to freeze out in the cold, and you lose the crop, which is why this is not done. No farmer will go out in the middle of January and February and open all the blossoms up and speed up spring, and then turn off the heaters and let the blossoms freeze to death in the crop. It's unproductive. It's destructive. What happens is, as the weather system in the environment warms up, and in a cultural system, as a culture matures, as it goes through the self-centeredness of its childlike nature, the self-centeredness of its adolescent-like nature, and moves towards adulthood. Adulthood is defined by the nurturing parent being in service to first the inner psyche, the scared and self-centered child, the curious and self-centered and lustful adolescent, the feminine side, the masculine side, inside, all the different faces of the psyche. The adult is defined as the one who presides over, who nurtures, who cares for that which is within, the inner kingdom. And an adult culture is defined by a culture that cares for the most vulnerable parts of the culture, the elderly, the children, the disabled, minorities. You can tell the maturity of a culture by the decency and empathy by which the most marginalized groups in the culture are treated. And so in our culture, if immigrants, if African American men, who are the most likely to be involved with the criminal justice system, I think it's 30% at present, in one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world, including dictatorships, is happening right here in the United States. We can see that we haven't reached beyond adolescence as a culture. So very few people produced by the culture, and it's very significant and it's very important to understand just how much our individuals in our culture are byproducts of the culture. Meaning there's nothing wrong with the brain, and if children are brought into competent, low-trauma households with highly empathic neighbors, they move very rapidly into the empathic state, and some of them start popping into transcendent states. Transcendent states is the region of the brain that is reserved for environments of high empathy, because that is the condition in which opening up that bud of union, of being one with, is healthy and leads to survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem. In a sociopathic environment like a prison system, and if someone opens up into a transcendent state and trusts the inmates in there that are in a reptilian state, they're quickly fed upon and preyed upon, picked on, etc., until they collapse down into a reptilian state and get the message that this isn't an environment where transcendence is honored, where transcendence is understood, where transcendence is empathized with, where transcendence is respected. You better adopt a fight, flight, freeze dynamic if you're going to survive in this sociopathic system, which is why, of course, so many of our prisoners focus on bulking up, being silent, looking mean, because in a sociopathic state where you're surrounded by reptiles, the calculation of who to attack and who to feed on is all about mass. There's no empathy involved, and you can think of that in the animal kingdom. When a lion runs after a zebra herd, and they attack the stragglers. And who are the stragglers in any herd? They are the newly born. They are the pregnant mothers. They are the sick. They are the elderly. They are the deformed. And the lion will attack the most weak in an animal system because they're running on a reptilian/mammalian brain where it's not about empathy. A lion doesn't think, oh my goodness, this zebra is just about to give birth to a new zebra. I'm going to let them be. This foal, this baby zebra has just been born. I'm going to go for the strongest. Now, the strongest always outrun the lion. They're at the front. They're the alphas. And so when you're dealing with reptilian thinking, you attack the weak. And so in corporate policies and protocols within a capitalist framework where capital is elevated above human beings, the attack goes to the company that you can crush. And it is the largest company, the Microsofts, that kill off superior software because they're smaller, or the Larry Ellisons that go after the PeopleSofts that have a better product and a very happy clientele, but they're eating into some of Ellison's core offerings. And so with fear of superior mass, don't buy this company. You may like their product better than ours, but we're going to crush them. We're going to kill them. We're going to lay these people off. We're going to destroy this company. Not because we're better, but because we're bigger. Because we've got the money to wait them out, to harass them, to tie them up in various hostile takeovers. We're going to take them down. And so in these environments, if your company is being attacked by a Larry Ellison or a Bill Gates, you don't focus on empathy. You're in a sociopathic ecology. And so you have to, since you don't have mass, you have to focus on outwitting, outsmarting. And if you can outsmart the bully in a sociopathic protocol, you survive. Otherwise, all your people get laid off. And so this is the environment, and we instinctively migrate constantly. Often highly predatory reptiles will soften and enter the empathic brain when they're at home. These CEOs don't necessarily prey on their children, though it's a little bit of an effort to shift gears out of being reptilian at work in a corporate environment, being reptilian in a police state or something of that nature. If you're beating the homeless, if you're waking up the most vulnerable people in the culture in their cars, something that's happening in my city, if you wake people with PTSD up in their cars because they have the misfortune of having an IQ that doesn't qualify for the average $250,000 a year salary of my county. And so they can't afford $1 million home, which is the average price, or a $650,000 home, which is the lowest price that you can find. Markets being driven up in a capitalist framework to the highest bidder. Someone from McDonald's doesn't get to buy a $650,000 house. And not everyone has the IQ structure or the temperament to be highly aggressive, in a business environment. When these people are the ones that are preyed upon and you're a policeman, and you learn to shut off empathy in order to harass the most vulnerable, then when you come home, it's harder, because as you transition out of the sociopathic state of the reptile, of the predator, abusing public funds to harass the most vulnerable in the public, you're now moving into a terrain to supposedly be a good dad, be a good mom, etc., for your children, who are in the same state as the homeless. They're in a dependent state. They're in a vulnerable state. They may be sick. And so it's harder to make that transition. But nonetheless, there is a greater safety at home. And so sometimes that brutality will melt away after a few hours, and you become a human being, coming from the human empathic areas of your brain again. So this cultural influence is enormous, and people, as a statistical majority, will adjust to the level of empathy versus sociopathic set point of their culture as a default. And that's the state, that's the brain, or the brain level, or the consciousness level that a culture produces. So what a psychedelic experience does is it bypasses all of the memories and all of the sociopathic feedback from your culture to create a microculture for a matter of a few hours. And in that microculture, in which the fear regions of the brain are suppressed, and the trust regions of the brain, the empathic regions of the brain, are stimulated, you have a blossoming similar to, heating up an orchard temporarily in midwinter. And you can have blossoms within the psyche of transcendent consciousness that is not sustainable in the typical environment. But in some way it reveals the potential, who you really are. Because who we really are is transcendent beings. We are transcendent beings that regress down to the level of our culture in order to meet our needs, our human needs. Abraham Maslow has done extensive research on this. Every human needs to survive, needs to feel security of that survival, needs a sense of love and belonging and acceptance for who they are, and needs a sense of self-esteem. These are the four basic human needs. And in a cult that values money, that values rank, that values masculine traits, that values winning, even at sociopathic expense, meaning as long as you win. That's one of the great appeals of Donald Trump, is people like, in a sociopathic environment, people like someone that wins, that will hammer away, however brutally, at the opposition, etc., and win. And people will vote. When you're dealing with in a sociopathic culture, the voting is not do I like or feel warm and fuzzy about someone. It's will they win, and will the big guy, will the alpha fight for me? Because in a prison environment, the best way to survive if you are not an alpha is to ally yourself with an alpha, because then you have an abuse contract. I will please you, do this, provide this service, be your lover, whatever it is, but you protect me from the other alphas. And if you can ally yourself with the biggest alpha, you survive a sociopathic environment. So that's just a little bit of context for this kind of brief presentation, because it lies at the heart of the grief, of the concern, of the brokenheartedness, of the despair, the helplessness, the sadness of watching what is best within collapse. So for an individual transcendent consciousness to maintain itself outside, so you get a glimpse in the psychedelic environment, you get a glimpse of who you are. This is who you would be if the temperature in your cult was warm enough to support the blossoming of all that you are. It's actually the seventh in the hierarchy of human needs. First is to survive, and if you're among reptiles, that's engaging with reptiles as a reptile. Running away when a reptile is bigger than you don't rely on empathy when you're dealing with reptiles. And you try and, with love and belonging, secure a certain sense of loyalty. And it's not loyalty to ideals, it's loyalty to mass. Because mass, if you can form a big group and say we're all one and we're going to defeat the other group, this is where you have the abuse of minorities as opposed to the honoring and protection of minorities. If you're in a sociopathic reptilian state, when you're big, the first thing you do is attack and exploit those that are smaller. You go around on a world dominance campaign like a Hitler. And it's, of course, very interesting in psychological history to understand the pressures on an Adolf Hitler to regress down to a sociopathic level. No support to develop his art. No support for the innocence of his little boy in childhood, if you read the biographies of his parentage. No support from the global community, meaning when Germany lost the First World War, Germans were eating leather and being forced to pay extreme debt reparations that would put them in shame and poverty for decades. And if you're growing up and the world is against you, meaning the entire world is okay with you eating leather and doing this and that and the other, when you're being beaten by parents in a sociopathic state in that environment, when your artistic, your feminine side is shunted aside as useless, what is cultivated in response to that sociopathic pressure on all sides is a reptilian brain. A reptilian brain that understands that the only way to win in this sociopathic circle of which one is a part is to be at the top of the dominance hierarchy and then to kill off the enemy. And so Hitler goes to war with the world and almost wins. But it's that drive to survive, feel secure, have a sense of love and belonging, have a sense of esteem. One of the ideals, self-esteem, is the realization of one's ideal. So if one aspires to be kind, when you are kind, you gain self-esteem. If you aspire in a sociopathic environment to be powerful, you gain self-esteem. It's your ideal. And the more brutal the environment around you, the more your ideal is about dominance and power, because that's what survives in a brutal sociopathic environment. People didn't back off Germany because they cared about the children in Germany, the Adolf Hitlers growing up. They backed off when Germany was strong. That's when the appeasement dynamic occurs. And if you have a sociopathic protocol towards a country, one of the things Carl Jung talked about is that any part of the psyche that is rejected, unloved, and repressed will regress, meaning move down the brain stem towards the reptilian brain, one, but also regress to the youngest ages, the tyrannical child or the competitiveness of adolescence will regress down and feel hatred, feel hostile at the forces and the power structures around them that did not empathize, that did not care. And this is an evolutionary process. It's very important to understand that sociopathic power structures are the enemy of the healthy, growing individual. Meaning, if you follow the human needs after self-esteem, we need to develop our gifts. We need support to develop our gifts. We need a space in our cult, in our culture, to bring those gifts out effectively and powerfully. And what we need is the opportunity to experience the synergy, the abundance, the honor that comes from bringing wealth. When an individual competently moves through survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, develops their gifts, and brings them out into the community with honor, there is always an exponential increase in the probability field. That is the community. meaning the community benefits from that, particularly if you understand the innate that we are part of nature and that nature is always doing checks and balances to move towards symmetry. Then you see that the psyches that are born with unique gifts are the very gifts that are needed to bring that culture towards health. However, the cult in culture is about killing off the new to maintain the status quo. It's about killing off joy, transcendence, creativity, uniqueness that deviates from the cult's norms. Because a cult's primary function in a fear-based or in a traumatically based populace is to create stability. Because if you're frightened, growing up in a sociopathic environment, if you're frightened, your biggest fear is always of the unknown. And so what a cult does is says, we're going to establish a status quo. That way you won't have to be frightened of the unknown. Now, to maintain the status quo, we are going to attack and sanction the attack on all minorities, on all anomalous and unique individuals. Anyone that steps out of line, we're going to humiliate them. We'll humiliate them in high school. We'll humiliate the gays. We'll humiliate people that don't believe in our religion. We will attack. We will withdraw funding from African Americans. We're just not going, because it's different. In a fear-based cult, the goal of the cult is to maintain a status quo and attack change. And people feel comfortable with that. And so they'll go along with it. May not seem quite right, but yeah, that was a little weird, wasn't it? Let's get them. They're not like us. Let's get them. And so you can also measure the level of trauma in a cult by how rational or irrational, how brutal or humane is the attack on the minority. Obviously, in Hitler's case, let's burn all the Jews up. They're not like us. And in an abuse cult, there's a certain sense that if we can all be the same, get rid of the foreigners, close the borders, then we get to relax because the norm has been maintained. And so that's really at the heart of every attack at an anomalous individual. And we do this on all different levels. They looked at me differently than everyone else looks. But if you understand that the cult does what it did before, not what is intelligent. If you analyze, if you travel around the world, you can spot Americans, one, and you can spot people from different nationalities, because there are tendencies of, if you're raised in a given cult, there will be certain tendencies. For example, in America, where there's a lot of egocentricity, you will see Americans in Thailand, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in their countries, actually getting angry at business people in those countries for not speaking English. And you will never see a Thai individual in a United States supermarket jabbering away in Thai and pretending that the U.S. store owner is a complete moron because they don't speak Thai. The Thais are not that egocentric. But an American will do this in a Thai business. What, you don't speak my language? You want me to speak your language in your country? And so these are some of the underlying traits that are exported, that just show up. They're the default mode unless you do a lot of work to clear the racism, clear the chauvinism, clear the bigotry, clear the arrogance out of the cult, out of your psyche where it's been programmed in formative years. You will default to the cult to which you belong, which I always find it very interesting that almost every culture that I visit knows more about me and Americans than I know about them, or that America knows about them. And you can tell a certain level of maturity there. Because maturity is also, you can tell a mature adult by the transcendence of, I need this, the child, I want this, the adolescent, to how can I connect with you? The outer focus is a symptom of an adult, is a symptom of maturity. A little bit of context. So in the psychedelic experience with Peter Sandhill, so we have the high dose of psilocybin, we have MDMA, a new part of me is born, meaning I get to see parts of my transcendent consciousness that I've never seen before. And it begins to change what I say, how I see things. It's a transcendent consciousness. And this state is, scientifically speaking, a superior state, meaning the mathematical probability field for human well-being of 1,000 people in a transcendent state, functioning as adults and showing interest in other people and partnering empathically with a focus beyond the individual is profound. 1,000 people in a transcendent state have a possibility and a probability of creating human well-being 100 times, 1,000 times more than the same 1,000 people interacting out of the reptilian brainstem. You take 1,000 people in fight, flight, and freeze, and at best you get kind of nonviolent, cooperated dominance, where, that's business, for example. You were doing a perfectly good job, but there was another company with $1 million that dropped prices, cut you out of the market once you were out of business, bought you up, or then raised prices back up. And so they won that race because of size. And here we see 30% of U.S. malls being closed by Amazon, which is using more and more robots that work 24/7 in these massive scale that outcompete the mom and pop industries in towns, and show, of course, zero regard. It's a capitalist framework, so there's zero regard for the fact that that means 1/3 of the U.S. workforce, as these businesses collapse, don't have another thing to do. And that's considered great, because that loss in well-being and small-town viability is not measured in capitalism. And we don't have humanitarian metrics, because that would involve the empathic brain rather than the reptilian brain. So what is needed as this part is born? And this, in initiation rites in many tribes, this is when a young man was considered an adult. After an initiatory experience, after a facing of the unknown without fear, in a transcendent state, unlike a cult where the greatest fear is the unknown, in a transcendent state you enter the unknown as your friend. And so you see new things. And this is a key point in the bringing of gifts that are unique to the individual into the community. So it's held in place. The environment that maintains and supports the transcendent state is, number one, empathy. Loving enough to see, seeing enough to understand, understanding enough to have empathy. If you really understand someone, if your mirror neurons adjust to another human being in their world, and you understand their memories, their experiences, their needs, their abilities, and their disabilities. Everyone has abilities and disabilities. I use the wheelchair example. Some people don't have the ability to articulate, but they can climb a rock face just fine. The abilities and disabilities are unique. We all have boundaries, limits, what we're good at and what we're not good at. When there is competent love, you reach the point of understanding and empathy, and you attune. And out of that attunement process with empathy comes success. And that's the point of competency. Love migrates from its feminine expression to the masculine expression of competency, and then moves on to regenerate love. Because the feeling of being loved with competence creates profound levels of trust and trustworthiness. It creates trustworthiness, which creates trust, creates abundance, creates safety, creates gratitude, which synergizes in the heart, the scientific instrument of the human heart, to create the feeling of love. And a loving person, having watched someone go through that process to love them with competence, capable of generating a spontaneous, it's not a forced thing. The fourth commandment, thou shalt love thy parents, it's not a forced thing. You cannot dictate that someone feels loved or feels love. The feeling comes out of the competence. That's how the virus of that human emotion is transmitted. And then they will tend to follow that template to see so when they feel love for someone, they will then start with see enough to understand enough to empathize enough to attune enough to succeed. At what? At generating shared well-being. And in succeeding, create gratitude, trustworthiness, safety, and love again blossoms. And so this template is really important. And it's very striking to me that in 45 years of therapy, various schools, living in different Western countries, no one has ever broken that down to me. I've had plenty of grown-ups, not adults, tell me that I should be feeling love at people failing to attune, failing to understand, failing to see, and abusing me. You should feel grateful. You should do this. That's when you get a blame-shame cult to fill in the gap in competency. You should feel this, but it's a natural feeling. It's like a plant. If you give this plant water, sunlight, proper soil, it will bloom. That's what it wants to do. If you flood it with arsenic and burn it, it doesn't grow. Not because that's not its nature, but because you lack the competency to provide the environment in which that plant becomes itself. So you need empathy. Now you also need change and transformation, because in a transcendent state, in a psychedelic experience, by definition, if you need a psychedelic, your cult, your environment was inadequate to produce a transcendent state that is available within every one of our brains. The hardware is there. The feedback loop, am I in a safe environment? Do these people really care about me? That bit isn't there. And so you stay at the level of your cult as a general rule. So this part, being born, needs increased empathy to be sustainable, needs increased change in the things that are cruel, that are undercutting. For example, emotional illiteracy. You cannot develop competency and love when you're emotionally illiterate, if you don't understand the difference between a feeling and an emotion, which, again, I didn't understand until quite recently. You also need truth and sanity. You need truth, which leads to sanity. You can't have secrets and taboos and be in a transcendent state, because secrets and taboos come from fear. They don't come from love and care and empathy. People keep secrets out of fear. It takes energy to keep a secret. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to let anyone see this. You're dealing with a sociopathic environment. You need mass support, meaning, by definition, an individual that is kind of blossoming out of the strata of the predominant cult needs the support of the mass. Going back to that phenomena in a sociopathic environment, the big one always wins, Because even if you're in a transcendent state, by the time you've been whacked over the head, humiliated, shamed, laughed at for being too sensitive or too emotional, you're no longer in a transcendent state. So you need mass support. You need support from leadership. And the most competent leader in a country, in an organization, etc., is promoting the transcendent state by creating a safe environment. Now, you also, of course, have that in Human Awareness Institute, where within there is mass support in a workshop to open up beyond the amount that the cult supports. So if you behave the way you do in a high workshop outside of a high workshop, you get dishonored and you collapse down to the level of the cult. And this is kind of talked as withdrawal symptoms, etc. The same is true to a much greater extent with a high psychedelic dose. You need inclusion and belonging. It's the cornerstone of empathy, and it's a human need. If you do not feel that you are welcome in a transcendent state, because it's viewed as odd, because it's not what we're doing, the cult dogma says that's not normal. If you're viewed as odd, you get excluded for development rather than welcomed and honored. I've often thought that the best immigration policy any country could have would be to recognize transcendent individuals of any amount of money and any amount of education and any amount of what, it doesn't matter. If someone is in a transcendent state, worried and concerned and behaving out of well-being, if someone is bringing well-being to the people that they encounter, you want that person in your country, period. They're doing more than any government program, etc., to spread the virus of empathy, the virus of competent love. You want them in. And if someone is bringing reptilian trauma to your community or your country, it doesn't matter if they have $1 billion. You do not want that person in your country if you want well-being, which is the ultimate metric of intelligence. Intelligence is the efficiency with which energy, time, money, and natural resources are turned into sustainable human well-being. And so if you're intelligent, you want the people in your group, in your family, in your culture, in your friendship circle who are in empathic to transcendent states. And you will honor them in that state because they are the future. The entire species has a transcendent brain. And if you look at the mathematics of well-being, the amount of energy that is conserved from fear, protection, secrets, locks on doors, car alarms, safety measures, guns, the amount of energy that is conserved in hostile defense to a sociopathic environment by everyone being in a transcendent state versus the amount of energy that must be chronically spent on just basically survival. The reptilian brain is really about survival. It's not about enjoyment. It's no fun. And so the only reason to be in a reptilian state is if you're surrounded by reptiles and you're trying to get to survival or security of survival. There's no love and belonging at a deep level in a reptilian state. There are alliances between alligators. We'll both gang up on this group of people and we'll really kill them or obliterate them in business, etc. If we're, so you have the mergers, going on, and we're bigger and we're going to dominate the market, etc. for our shareholders. So inclusion and belonging is an essential ingredient for sustaining a transcendent state. Honor and kingship, also essential. A king, much like an adult, it's another archetype, or queen, king, adult, nurturing parent. They're all the same. The adult in the room is most concerned about the most vulnerable parts in the group, and that's kingship. When the president serves the most vulnerable people in their community, in their country, etc., the country grows. When in the dictatorship paradigms, etc., when the king figure, when the alpha, uses their dominance to harm and exploit the minorities for personal gain, the culture collapses. Mathematically speaking, there is an exponential return on well-being per unit of energy invested when you have adults, when you have kingship. And Robert Bly touches on some of the crisis in the American cult in his book, A Sibling Society, a society of children and teenagers in consciousness, in grown-up bodies, who feed on their children for emotional needs, who are looking to get in relationship. I need this, I need that. It's all about me. We're dealing with competitive siblings rather than adults who have reached the point of competence of being able to take care of themselves and show an interest in community. So honor and kingship is important. And if you're a king, you honor your monks. You honor your meditators. You honor your women, your children who are in a transcendent state, in a non-traumatic environment that is attuned to the child. Children are also in a transcendent state much of the time, infants. But in a sociopathic cult, by the time they're children, they've learned that in order to survive, they've got to manipulate and to get their needs met. But when they're born, you've got the grace. You've got all the brains are functioning, and then they regress down to the level of the cult. I've already talked about love. You also need ego sacrifice, because the attachment to the dogma or to the status quo of what's going on, to a certain way of seeing things, is always at odds with a growing environment. So you need to let go of the status quo of blocking change, of I know best, etc., to make room for something bigger, a bigger probability field to come in. So this is the environment that is necessary to honor and sustain a transcendent state. And what's interesting is the way that this, of course, didn't happen with Peter Sandhill. As I'm beginning to open up, the first things out of my mouth to Peter Sandhill are, "You really hurt me," in the earlier therapy session in which he expressed sexual interest in me and began using our time to talk about open marriage and the fact that he was looking for a male lover, and the fact that he was interested in me, as I learned from his erection in our first session. This is the grown-up, the leader in the therapeutic vertical role, preying upon the vulnerable to meet their needs and be paid for it at the same time, and then have it relabeled as love. So when I said, "You really hurt me," he brushed that over because that truth wasn't welcome. See, truth has to be welcome and protected by the big one as it's emerging. It's very, it's like a seedling. This transcendent consciousness, it has very little room to grow in our culture in any way, but in a psychedelic experience, if your therapist has ego agendas to defending blind spots, to avoiding accountability and responsibility, to blocking change, and is not empathetic to the profound vulnerability of the virginal psychedelic state, and as I said, this was my first psychedelic experience, you have a large body, an older man in a position of authority and leadership, a facilitator of my community, the Human Awareness Institute, saying no, we're not looking at my shadow side. If that's what needs to come out, I'm blocking it. So he pushes that aside. And this is, and we have, of course, betrayal, etc., because he had just promised to take a stand for me. But within the first moments, he's revealing that, in fact, he's taking a stand for himself. What self, though? The reptilian brainstem that is afraid of getting punished. So the ego is not sacrificed. And the suggestibility of the psychedelic state is used by Mass to kind of push that down. Now, as it then turns out that he didn't include the facilitators, he didn't include his wife, he lied to his wife, you see the betrayal, the lack of empathy. He's not empathizing with his wife either. He's not empathizing with the community. He's not empathizing with his patient. He's not empathizing with his colleagues. So this environment is not there at the same time that he's pushing for this high dose. And so this, I guess the outrage, the grief, the brokenheartedness that I feel is the kind of forced birth into some of the most beautiful potentials and states in my psyche, followed by the immediate pouring on of ice and betrayal, etc., to watch those parts betrayed, ripped apart by the very person in the role of the king, in the role of the healer, in the role of the therapist, the one that needs to be learning and growing, to open to truth, to support, to make sure that this new self is welcome. It's not welcome, though, because it threatens Peter Sandhill's ego. And this is the difference in competency. And of course, he's calling it love, but it's really insanity. There's no love there, because there's no protocol of seeing. I'm going to push you into this. I don't need to know anything about you. I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to hear your truths. And so time and time again, as I asked him to take money out of what became, as he escalated, a lover relationship within the therapeutic container, I asked him to take money out of it. That is appropriate. That was fought. That was fought tooth and nail to this day, meaning he's never even offered a refund. And so and then as that escalates to an abuse point of grief, brokenheartedness, betrayal, etc., that I take this to the high facilitators. They also have egos to protect. In this case, the projected ego of the Human Awareness Institute. We've got to protect the Institute. Screw the client, screw the public, screw protocols, screw competency. We've got to protect the image, the identity, our identity, against the threat. You see, and so here we understand the reptilian consciousness, against the threat to our fear. And so if we move over here, so this is what's needed for this to blossom and be sustainable, which is incredibly beneficial for any group, any organization, any power structure. It's incredibly beneficial to know the science of creating an environment that induces transcendent states and sustains it. Doesn't immediately, once the blossoms are open, hail down on it and rip up the buds and ruin the crop, but actually leads to a harvest. And this is, of course, what our indigenous tribes are so good at. The indigenous tribes, in their initiation rituals, often involving some kind of transcendent snuff or otherwise, The Emerald Forest is a movie that does a pretty decent job of giving a small window into the technologies that we've lost with a sociopathic dominance protocol of bullying other cults, other cultures into obliteration for hundreds of years in our nation's history. Whether it's the Incas, we have obliterated the psychic heritage of this planet in the same way. Meaning it's not a surprise that Peter Sandhill would behave this way, being raised in this cult. It's just a tragedy. If you go to the fear, PTSD, reptilian brain, which I've found myself stuck in most of the time since this protocol of betrayal, blockage, inclusion, etc. Fighting for secrets and hiding the truth and all this. what holds the fear and reptilian brain as the centerpiece. And and what's interesting is in base evolutionary terms, when you have, like, why did Hitler go to war on the world? Well, he's demonized, and we like to have good guys and bad guys. But the world has never grappled with reducing Germany to a state of reptilian survival and then leaving them there with sociopathic cruelty, which, if you can choose between dominating your oppressors or just being left there in a small regress state, a culture will always choose to move out of that small state to attack the enemy. So I'm not saying the world is to blame and Hitler isn't. I'm saying there's a dynamic. There's a dynamic that is predictable if you understand traumatic brain function. But we are committed in an emotionally illiterate cult to suppressing that information for financial gain. Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, tracks the emergence and the suppression of trauma in cultures for thousands of years, and talks about the way the British attacked scientists for speaking about what was then being called shell shock, because it was preferable to shame the men after World War I. It was preferable to shame the men for being weak, for having symptoms of PTSD after nerve gas and all kinds of horrific experiences, rather than to fund their rehabilitation. The Irish, in many of the mythologies where they had the kind of the warriors would actually enter a certain transcendent state where they felt no pain, etc., and they would be killing machines. Naked, painted blue, racing through. They were unstoppable. But these cultures understood that men in this state were unsafe for children, were unsafe for women. And so there was an honoring process of cooling them down, of singing, of chanting, of celebrating, of being encircled by women, to take them out of the dissociated traumatic state that allowed them to be killing machines and to become human again. And only when they were human were they given to the children. We do not protect our children in that way. The U.S. government, as we speak, is covering up in special tribunals the family abuse of Iraqi and Afghanistan war veterans who are beating the shit out of their children, and they are stuck in PTSD. And rather than bringing our men home, we have actually systematically and pathologically and unscientifically suppressed the use of psychedelics like MDMA, etc., and forced our veterans into incredible suppression protocols of chronic drug use that is not healing them. And this is being taken out on our women and children as we speak. It is a pathologic, and it's done for cost. It's done for cost, much as the veterans from Vietnam came home and were shamed for the cult's inadequacies. You see, these men trusted their country, and they were lied to about the need for the war. They were lied to about the war being good for America. They were asked to kill and drop burning flames on living women and children. They were asked to shoot up villages, and then they were deposited in American homes. And my father is a survivor from this protocol in World War II. And again, the military, if you look at the various track record, the military suppresses the information about trauma rather than introducing it into the education system, because it doesn't want to pay for the rehabilitation of human beings to turn soldiers back into men. And then that is unleashed in our children in a pathological cruelty that is unspeakable. To give an infant to a man in that state is murder, and it's being done right now. And so, why are we in a traumatized sociopathic state as a cult? When reptiles are in charge in any power structure, it's about looking good, protecting the image, suppressing the truth, and betraying the humanity for profit, for a little bit extra money, so we can spend more money on nuclear weapons rather than rehabilitating our men. So you will get reptiles in Washington when you raise reptiles at home. You will raise reptiles at home when you expose children to reptiles in infancy and regress them down to a state of trauma. Who is elected in Washington? People raised in this cult. So it is completely absurd to expect to traumatize our individuals, much as it's completely absurd to expect Hitler to be a humane human being after the systematic abuse protocol of his upbringing. We raised a pathological dictator. And it is no different with Donald Trump. The childhood messages of values, the dehumanization of his feminine self, the pathological message from his father, be a winner or I'm ashamed of you and you don't belong. Be a sociopath in business like me, produces a terrified ego who is desperate for survival, security, love, and belonging in a cult that will only give it to him if he at least pretends, while losing lots of money, admittedly. But he would fake his ranking on the Forbes 400 list. Why? Because he's in a cult that ranks his value as a man by how much money he has. So even while he's losing more money than any person in the country, something that came out with the IRS, he's fudging the numbers to climb the Forbes 400 list of the most wealthy individuals, pretending to have billions, so that he can be valued in a cult that values money more than a human being. If we raise reptiles by reptiles, we get more reptiles. And, this is a chicken and the egg dynamic. At some level, you can pity an individual that has no sense of value other than dominance, other than money, other than his image, and is willing to sacrifice all humanity in the process. You can pity the high facilitators for being willing to throw a traumatized, abused client under the bus to protect High's image with secrecy and lies. You can pity them. They were raised in a reptilian state. You can pity the team in the community that is silent. Not a peep. No confrontation of the abuse. Because High is bigger than them. High has the power structure. And when you're raised in an abuse cult, you learn that it doesn't matter who's right. What matters is who has the mass. And when you're regressed in a psychedelic state, when you're grief-stricken and in a traumatized state, and all your therapists gang up on you, and your community leaders say, we don't want you in this community if you need to tell the truth or advocate for this state and the insights that come from it. What we're saying is we don't want initiated men in our community. We don't want initiated adults. In fact, they're a threat to the status quo. Get rid of them. Lie to them. Get them out of here. Cut their email accounts off. And so as we move to the fear PTSD state, as I say, the most tragic experience for me in this whole process was moving from this state inexorably towards this state with zero support to stay in this state, which aligns with my self-esteem. To maintain fear and PTSD, it takes just as much effort to maintain fear and PTSD as it does to maintain a transcendent state. The results are just far more mediocre and painful. You have betrayal. According to Jason Weston and Peter Sandhill and all the facilitators, this was not something for them to apologize for. It was not a high issue, nor was it a Peter issue. You know, I have a recording of Peter Sandhill where he insisted on charging me $175 an hour. And I'm really getting hurt. And I don't want to fight him because he's the authority figure. And I don't want to fight. That's, you know, I'm trying to hang on to this transcendent consciousness of we're one. So I go along with it. Okay, I'll pay my abuser $175 an hour to make my case that he has some things to apologize for. No, not a chance. He cuts me off right at the hour. Not a single word of apology. I make a whole case of everything that's hurt me. Nothing. It's not his issue. Then he goes and finds healers. Obviously, in quotes, because no healer functions this way. Healers who, without meeting me, who without seeing me, who without understanding me, who without attuning or empathizing with me, back Peter up and say, yeah, this isn't Peter's fault at all. It's your fault. Exclusion, insanity, betrayal. And so how does what is beautiful and good in each one of us be sustained in a pathological abuse environment? It doesn't. It dies. It regresses. And in that regress state, it becomes hostile. And this is one of the saddest and funniest things simultaneously. It's both a tremendous tragedy. You can cry with absurdity, or you can cry in grief that the Human Awareness Institute systematically created an enemy out of their best friend. The insights that come from transcendent consciousness. Every single thing that I advocated for in this state, that Peter dealt with hurting me 10 years ago, and that he not charge for a lover experience, that he not betray his wife, that he look at his blind spots, these are in everyone's interest, except the ego of the fear-based abuse power structure. When someone in an ignorant state is protecting the known. This is how we do it, was what Peter Rangel said at High. I'm not going to read your emails. I'm not going to see you. I'm not going to attune to you. I'm certainly not going to empathize with you. I'm not going to adjust. This is how we do things here. That's a cult speaking. It's not a human being. It's not someone being loving. Now, the only problem with an abuse cult teaching love is you create insanity. If you pass that off as love and don't parse it out, and High gets away with that in part by not defining love. I've provided a definition that works for adult love. Child love, I need you. Adolescent love, I want you. I want to fuck you. Adult love, how can I be of service to you moving through your human needs to realize your potential? It's about the other. It's about seeing and attuning to them. That's service. That's kingship. That's an adult. We don't even know what that is in this culture. Betrayal. Resisting change. We're not supporting change. We're fighting change. Lies. I think anyone can understand the absolute core of the lie in Jason Weston repeatedly saying, and the facilitators acting to this day as if this is not a high issue. Now, if this is mainstream New York Times coverage, if the New York Times publishes an article tomorrow, and they may, if it comes to that, but if the New York Times publishes an article tomorrow, sex cult covers up sexual abuse by a therapist for money, is that a high issue? Of course it is, because it's attacking the image, and it's the image that's trying to be protected, not the citizen, not the therapeutic patient, the image. That's a high issue in a sociopathic state. When you discard the therapeutic patient to protect the image, and you say that your image is the high issue, not taking care of your client, you're of course completely backwards, but it makes sense from a sociopathic point of view, because the image affects the viability of high. If you're killing clients, hurting them, whatever, that, if it's not, doesn't get out, we can continue. We can bury the secret. Resist change, lies, silence and manipulation. When the most important female advocate for me in my life, Ann Watts, when her first push from me is to go from my plan to tell the community what's happening, which means that you have the right to choose. You see, when a pharmaceutical company suppresses the negative data regarding certain studies and their drug, it is a criminal offense, because the public cannot make a competent decision about whether they should take the drug or not unless they know the statistical benefits and harms. They need all the data. So the way drug companies get around this is they've noticed that if they do 100 studies, there will be at least some of them through random chance that come out promoting their drugs. So what they do is they fund 100 studies privately, and then they publish the minority, in the case of questionable drugs, that suggest that their drug is more valuable than it actually is and has lower risks than it actually has. This is the reason why the family behind OxyContin, that made billions of dollars by suppressing the addictive nature of OxyContin, is being sued by a number of states, because the states are having to pay the price for the lies and betrayal of the manufacturer of OxyContin and the policy of suppressing this information and shaming addicts who were told to call for help and then were shamed into believing that it was their fault rather than taking ownership. And this is the opposite of medicine. It's the opposite of healing. It is blatant evil. If life and evolution is living and moving things forward, then evil is going backwards. And the best way that you can go backwards and hurt people the most is to lie and suppress the truth, so that when they believe they're spending money to advance, they're actually going backwards, but they don't know it, and they don't know why. And then they are blamed, so that the officials involved can avoid responsibility for incompetence or betrayal or suppression of information. This is blatant evil. I don't know of anything that is worse than taking the innocence, the trust, the willingness to put money, vulnerability, take time off work, and believe in a professional who says they love you, to be systematically abused and thrown under the bus, and have that covered up and have it called love. You can't get more crazy than that. It's bad enough that our sociopathic, for-profit corporations, that our presidents do this bullshit. But to have healers in a school, this is unconscionable. It is evil. Silence and manipulation. Ann Watts, who I look to for support, said, "Do not tell the community." And I could hear in her voice that she was angry about this. I've never heard Ann Watts, I've done lots of couples therapy and stuff with her, I've never heard that aggression. She's never fought for me the way she fought to suppress the truth. At a time I was still regressed, needed support, was highly traumatized, moving towards PTSD by the exclusion protocol. We are not going to help you at the Human Awareness Institute to get back on your feet here. This is not a high issue End of subject. We're going to meet with your abuser behind closed doors. And we're going to close ranks to shove you out in the cold and let you know your transcendent consciousness, your heart, your feminine energy is not welcome here because it's threatening our dogma. Get the fuck out of here. And I watched these blossoms wither. It felt like watching one part after another of myself numb over in the cold. And I shut down. Emotionally, mentally, and physically. I am still at least 30% shut down in this moment. Now, I've developed the technology of speaking above the shutdown through thousands of hours of video. That's what it took. And I'm still not here. Those parts are frozen in the cold, created by a sociopathic environment, by the people I trusted to heal. This is evil. It's wrong. You know it. I know it. Every competent medical person in this country knows it. The courts know it. A jury can get this even without traumatic awareness, but it's that much crueler when the wound is in a traumatic domain in a country that is illiterate about trauma. Your wound is invisible by your cult's design, and that is in itself cruel. My father developed PTSD by the time he was 6 because his grandfather in World War II was not rehabilitated to save money at the Pentagon so that we could line up more money for war. And I had complex PTSD by the abuses of an enraged 6-year-old child in a man's body, in shame, who didn't know how to deal with that in a cult that refused to talk about trauma. Multi-generations of trauma and PTSD by the betrayal of our government. How many people have to be betrayed and how many generations because of the betrayal of the Human Awareness Institute? It's bad enough when our military behaves like a reptile. When therapists join in, you basically just blow a hole in the whole probability field of the species. Fuck it. Why should we grow? Pay money to get fucked up and thrown under the bus. What's the point? Cynicism rules in this environment, as it should. Our adolescents are not fools. Their brains are telling them they're surrounded by reptiles, and they are. They're also being surrounded by needy children in grown-up bodies who are begging them to lie so that they don't feel bad. Because we don't know how to be adults. And when one emerges, it is a threat to the status quo. This is how you kill off a country. Exclusion. I was not welcomed when I refused finally to keep the secret of the facilitators for the community's benefit and safety. My email accounts went dead without a word. Heartbeat went dead. No explanation, and of course they can't give one. How can you say we're cutting anyone on the high lists off who has any evidence about sexual abuse of a high facilitator? And let's be very clear, there's 10 hours of pathological abuse and betrayal by Peter Sandhill in the hands of every facilitator. I gave them the recording. This is not a he said, she said type of thing, nor is the long email lists of cover-ups. This is one systematic betrayal after another by a series of incompetent imbeciles. I mean, that's a kind word. Who know what to do and put their fear and their egos ahead of the transcendence. That is the opportunity. There is such an opportunity when someone sees things more clearly and asks you to upgrade the protocol to this is how cultures grow. Through anomalous, minority, unique individuals who care enough to see. And that growth is not welcome in the facilitator body. Protection of egos. You have profound incompetency. You don't have love moving to competency. You have abuse being called love and then attacking the victim for speaking up about it. You have secrets and taboos. I've met and talked with a few sexual abuse and other abuse survivors at High, and they all have the same sense. I cannot participate in the High community, and the gatekeepers, the High facilitators, will not let me in unless I agree not to talk about this. That is outrageous for an organization that wants to lead the culture in the response to the Me Too movement, women actually talking and telling the truth for once and being heard. You'll be excluded if you tell the truth. At the Human Awareness Institute? It makes no sense. Secrets, lies, betrayal. When 4 of your therapists, Ann Watts, Sarah Sandhill, Peter Sandhill, and Barbara Musser, gang up with this protocol and do anything but attune and welcome. You see, it's absolutely stunning to me, understanding what adult love actually is, that in the entirety of my interactions with every single facilitator on this issue, not one said, "How can I help you? What do you need? How are you doing? How are we doing? What else can we do?" Not one. This is where understanding and empathy becomes attunement. It's not love if you do not attune. The way evolution works, when you create a sociopathic environment for what is most healthy in the individual, is it regresses and becomes hostile. And the way evolution works is it relies on that. In an empathic framework, this never happens. In an empathic framework, every facilitator that I asked for help is checking in with me. How can we help? You want the community to know? Let's tell them. I advocated for that constantly. Let's tell them. That would make you feel safer. You feel like you're doing your conscience to let the community know their risks, and we'll do it. We'll take that off your back. You don't have to worry about it. This is our job. We're adults. We'll let the community know. That is a constant process, and trauma does not become PTSD. It dissipates in relief that empathy and love have prevailed. That's not what prevailed here. Children running and screaming to hide their image is what prevailed. But in one of the last emails from Ann Watts, she wants it called love. She says, "I've never loved anyone other than my family as much as I've loved you." And she's saying that at the moment where I'm just collapsing. I can't work. I can't function. And now I've got to deal with this as the definition of love? Secrecy, betrayals, no apology? You see, an apology is the cheapest form of empathy. An apology was never offered. I had to beg. I had to beg. And the amount of drivel that the facilitators came out with at this moment, I mean, it's laughable. I give a 10-point request for an apology, and I'm racking my brains to see how can you guys get out of this. You're digging yourselves into a hole. See, the worse that a nonprofit teaching love behaves, the more they have to be disbanded for public safety. It's the only logical, sane solution. So I'm trying to think, how can you get out of this? You're poor, you're poorly run, you don't know what you're doing. So I spell out the apology. If, and I'm thinking, this would help me so much if you would apologize for this, 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 and this, and this. It would give me hope that you are going to put the public first and that you care about your client. Because if you don't care about your client and the public, you have no business getting a tax break to serve the public, let alone teach them about love and sustainable relationships. This is the worst atrocity in relationships in my entire adult life. And our cult raises a large percentage of relationally dysfunctional people, systematically, by design. You will not get a single hour of emotional literacy in high school when you really need it. You will get no relational literacy, no traumatic. You will get nothing that you need to succeed in this cult. Just parents abusing you by reenacting intergenerational abuse contracts and abuse patterns and calling it love, which just confuses you. How can you come out of that with competence? You don't. This culture doesn't. We raise children and adolescents in a traumatic state that attempt lust under the mistake that it's love, that fall apart, that feel tremendously ashamed that they fail when they don't have an accurate map to succeed. And that is being perpetuated at high by suppressing all information. What is addiction, and what's the role of addiction when 1 in 7 Americans is a substance addict? What's trauma and PTSD? I asked Jason to bring trauma into high. He says it's not our focus. We want the whole world to win when no one in a traumatic state can win. And we're not going to deal with trauma in a highly traumatized cult, where we participate in the most egregious trauma to our clients, driving them to suicidal states, shaming them, ignoring them, cutting them off when they need the most help. So the real thing to get about this is not about high. Peter and every high facilitator followed the default mode of a relationally illiterate, traumatically illiterate, shame-based, fear-based cult in a largely sociopathic state. That's what this cult teaches. That's why we have a sociopath in the White House. You got to take pity on Trump. It's not his fault. He had a son of a bitch for a father in a cult that didn't value him unless he had money and power. It never answers the whole. I've been through this in this cult, achieving thousands of goals, getting more and more money. It never works. And I wonder, why aren't I feeling any better? One of the saddest things in this entire saga is coming to the realization that in more than $150,000 of therapy, demonstrating traumatic symptoms in just about every relationship, including the relationship with the 4 facilitators, not a single healer, be it a Reiki, be it an acupuncture, be it a healer, be it an energy healer, be it a masseuse, be it a therapist, be it a relationship coach, be it a couples counselor, not a single one recommended a trauma book, said, hey, you're behaving with some symptoms of trauma. And as a result of that blindness and that incompetence, every single one of the 30 lover relationships that I've had with high have been affected by a profound biological force that I had no language for. And the biggest mistake, and this is where defense goes into, because every traumatized population does not want change, because it brings up chaos. It brings up fear of the unknown, which triggers the latent trauma. And so there's all kinds of defenses. Oh, it'll never happen again. This was just this one incident. Bullshit. Peter's done this in every single relationship over 10 years. And Sarah Sandhill has covered it up rather than protect her client every single time. This is not going to happen again. No. It's just, and then comes in scapegoating. Let's see if we can make this about Dane. That is the cruelest and most sociopathic and cowardly thing of the whole thing. You know, Mitt Romney stood up in the U.S. Senate, the lone person who upheld the Constitution. I'm now the lone person standing up for High's mission statement. Every single thing I'm advocating for is consistent with High's mission, best practices, the law, science, you name it. But I'm the enemy. Of course, an abuse cult, Trump gets online and shames and attacks Mitt Romney for voting his conscience, for pointing out the obvious. You should really listen to the speech by Mitt Romney. It's beautiful. He's torn to shreds on Fox already. That's when you're dealing with alligators. The thing to realize, the reptilian brain is strong in each one of us. It has dominated much of my life. It is the biggest threat to loving relationships. It is not personal. You will encounter it. I would say 1 in 3 high lovers demonstrated traumatic abuse symptoms to me, and I had no language to understand it or respond. And I'll tell you something else. The first woman I met, and this is how crazy it gets in this world, I didn't learn about trauma or PTSD from Peter Sandhill, Ann Watt, any of my therapists, anyone at High. 100 High events, zip, about the most pervasive and important force that destroys relationships in this culture, that damages children. Parents with traumatic symptoms, etc., of course, pass them on to their children virally. I hear zip. I learn about trauma after the facilitators turned it into PTSD in a full-blown state where I couldn't function, by a stranger in a cafe. And within 5 minutes of hearing the title of Peter Levine's book, what was it? Healing Trauma, I got out my phone, opened the Audible app, downloaded the book, and listened to it that afternoon. That was my first step towards sanity. Now, that's a problem. $150,000 of therapies? And you learn the key thing you need to learn from strangers in cafes? This is not a small change that needs to get made. Every single value, protocol, state of consciousness about this power structure and about our cult must be transformed if we want to raise healthy individuals who become adults, who have any chance of reaching the transcendent states that are necessary if our species is going to respond to the ecological crisis that sociopathic states produce. As Einstein says, the same level of consciousness that creates a problem is incapable of solving it. In closing, I will just reiterate the absolute grief, helplessness, confusion, hurt, loneliness, pain, terror, and trauma that I experienced watching every healthy part of me actively fought by my entire community as they froze up and went numb. And I watched my consciousness go from the high of transcendent love, trying to help this organization grow and change and help the individuals involved learn and be adults, become a terrified, enraged reptile, expecting to die, unable to function, with enormous hatred and hostility towards this group of people as a threat to this country, as a threat to our culture, as a threat to their own mission and stated values. And that was a stunning education. It is a stunning education. And so I'm in two places. I'm working, and just to finish the story, the first woman I met who was in a traumatized state, after understanding the technology of trauma, which was denied by every single therapist that I've been to and every high workshop, is now my wife. And she, with the technology of trauma, is responsible as one person who tells the truth, as one person who empathizes, as one person willing to change and grow, as one person willing to give up ego, as one person letting me belong as I am, enters my life. One. I've been able to regain 30% of this transcendent consciousness. If you know how to read energy, you will see this is a mixed personality. There's aggression, there's fear, there's anger, all of the symptoms induced by sociopathic abuse protocols by these facilitators. And there's also care. There's education. There's consciousness. There's concern for the community. That's the transcendent state. And these folks tried to kill it because it threatened their own egos. They are not teachers in that behavior, and they cannot differentiate incompetence and cruelty and evil from the times that they are loving and beautiful and doing all this good stuff, from a pattern of denial, secrecy, and shame. It just doesn't work. So that's where we come to this big divide. Is high going to shut down to defend the egos? I did nothing wrong, and implode? Or is there some leadership individuals, anyone, willing to lead this organization consistent with its mission so that it serves public interest rather than destroying itself by destroying its clients, by committing to pathological cruelty, to incompetence, to ignorance, and to fear?